When the Ohio House of Horrors first made national headlines, millions of people were left asking the same question. How could 16 children allegedly endure years of unimaginable neglect without anyone stepping in? At the time, it seemed like investigators had uncovered the full story, but they hadn't. In the weeks since the rescue, detectives have quietly expanded their investigation, uncovered new leads, revisited the family's past, and begun asking questions that reach far beyond the walls of a single home. What initially appeared to be one horrifying discovery is now evolving into something much bigger. Authorities are examining previous residences, reviewing years of records, re-interviewing witnesses, and attempting to determine whether warning signs were missed long before the world ever heard the name Siders. At the same time, the criminal case is moving through the courts, new evidence is being scrutinized, and prosecutors are working to establish exactly what happened and who, if anyone, bears legal responsibility. But perhaps the most disturbing question is one that still doesn't have an answer. Was Hamden the first place this happened, or simply the first place where it was finally discovered? Today, we're looking beyond the initial headlines to examine the latest verified developments, the evidence investigators are now focusing on, and the unanswered questions that could shape one of Ohio's most significant child abuse prosecutions in recent history. The rescue of the 16 children may have marked the end of one chapter, but for investigators, it was only the beginning. Almost immediately after the children were removed from the Hamden property, detectives shifted their attention from what they had found inside the home to an even bigger question. How long had this been happening, and had it happened somewhere else before? That change in focus has shaped nearly every major development since the arrests. As investigators continue building what is expected to become a lengthy criminal prosecution, newly uncovered records, additional interviews, and evidence gathered from multiple locations are beginning to paint a much broader picture than anyone initially realized. And perhaps the biggest revelation is this: authorities no longer believe they are looking at a single, isolated property. They are investigating whether the conditions they discovered in Hamden were part of a much longer pattern. That possibility changes everything. Almost immediately after the children were removed from the Hamden property, detectives began tracing where the Siders family had lived over the years. Instead of finding a stable history with schools, medical providers, or social services, investigators reportedly encountered something very different: a family that appeared to move repeatedly, leaving behind very little documentation. For investigators, that's significant. Every move creates another timeline to reconstruct. Every former address becomes another potential source of evidence. Every county may hold records that explain what happened long before June 30th. As investigators retraced those movements, attention eventually shifted to another residence previously occupied by the family. Reports indicate that investigators examined another former home connected to the Siders family after concerns emerged that the conditions there may have mirrored what was found in Hamden. According to reporting from multiple outlets, individuals familiar with the property described finding severe neglect and evidence suggesting children had lived there under similarly troubling circumstances. Authorities have not publicly confirmed every allegation regarding that location, but the discovery has intensified efforts to determine how long the alleged abuse and neglect may have continued across multiple residences. That possibility is one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation, because if prosecutors can establish that the same conditions existed across multiple homes over several years, it could dramatically strengthen the argument that what occurred was not the result of temporary hardship or isolated poor decisions. Instead, it could support allegations of an ongoing pattern. And patterns are incredibly important in criminal cases involving prolonged child neglect. Meanwhile, investigators have also been examining whether earlier warning signs existed. One of the first major developments came when court records resurfaced from several years ago involving school attendance. According to those records, Gary Siders II and Elizabeth Siders had previously faced charges related to truancy after several of their children reportedly failed to attend school. That earlier case was ultimately dismissed after authorities were unable to locate the family. At the time, officials lost contact before the matter could move forward. Looking back now, those records have taken on an entirely different meaning. What once appeared to be a routine truancy case is now being examined as a potential missed opportunity. It raises uncomfortable questions. If the family had remained in contact with authorities then, would the children have been discovered years earlier? Could intervention have prevented years of alleged neglect? Those are questions investigators cannot answer with certainty. But they are questions many people are now asking. Another major development involves the children's condition after being removed from the home. Officials have stated that several children required immediate medical treatment after their rescue, with multiple children transported to hospitals for evaluation. Prosecutors have alleged that many of the children suffered from significant developmental delays, poor hygiene, malnutrition, and limited communication abilities. Those allegations will ultimately have to be proven in court, but they have already become central to the prosecution's case. Medical evaluations are now expected to play an enormous role in future court proceedings. Unlike witness testimony, medical evidence often provides measurable documentation. Doctors can evaluate nutritional deficiencies. Developmental specialists can assess cognitive delays. Psychologists can evaluate trauma. Each examination helps investigators reconstruct not just what the children experienced recently, but potentially what they endured over many years. That evidence could become some of the strongest presented during trial. Another significant development has been the continued legal proceedings involving all four defendants. Gary Siders II, Elizabeth Siders, Gary Siders Sr., and Christina Siders have each pleaded not guilty to the charges filed against them. The criminal process remains in its early stages, and under the law, every defendant is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. That distinction is extremely important. Much of what has been discussed publicly comes from prosecutors, investigators, and court filings. Those allegations are serious, but they remain allegations until tested through the judicial process. The defense will have opportunities to challenge evidence, question witnesses, and dispute the prosecution's timeline. That legal battle has only just begun. One issue that has generated considerable public discussion is bond. Court records show that bond was initially set for the defendants, although Gary Siders Sr. was later released after experiencing a medical emergency. Elizabeth Siders has also sought bond modifications while expressing a desire to reunite with her children, requests that have drawn significant public attention given the allegations in the case. Bond hearings often become emotional in cases involving children. For prosecutors, they argue the seriousness of the allegations and concerns about community safety. Defense attorneys focus on constitutional rights and the presumption of innocence. Judges must balance both considerations while ensuring the integrity of future proceedings. Beyond the courtroom, investigators are still piecing together one of the biggest mysteries of the case. How did 16 children remain largely hidden from public systems? Normally, children leave records: school enrollment, medical appointments, birth documentation, vaccination records, interactions with neighbors, community activities. Yet investigators have indicated that documentation for many of these children appears unusually limited, making it substantially more difficult to reconstruct their lives before the rescue. That lack of documentation creates enormous investigative challenges. Every missing record means investigators must locate alternative evidence. Former landlords, utility companies, neighbors, government agencies, previous employers, extended relatives. Every interview adds another small piece to a much larger puzzle. Authorities have also acknowledged the extraordinary strain the case has placed on local resources. Vinton County is a relatively small county, and officials have publicly stated that caring for 16 children with potentially extensive medical, educational, and psychological needs required assistance beyond what local agencies could reasonably provide. In response, Ohio announced emergency funding to help support the children's care and recovery. That funding represents more than financial assistance. It reflects recognition that recovery will likely take years. Physical recovery, educational recovery, emotional recovery, psychological recovery. Children who experience prolonged neglect often require extensive long-term support, and experts say healing can continue long after criminal cases conclude. Another development attracting attention involves additional charges unrelated to the child endangerment case. Court records indicate Gary Siders II also faces separate public indecency charges stemming from allegations that predate the discovery at the Hamden property. Those allegations are being handled through separate legal proceedings and should not be confused with the child endangerment case itself. Although legally separate, the existence of multiple criminal proceedings has intensified public scrutiny surrounding the family. For investigators, however, each case follows its own evidentiary standards. Separate allegations require separate proof, separate witnesses, separate court proceedings, and separate verdicts. Perhaps the most striking change since this story first broke is the shift in how investigators are talking about the timeline. Early coverage focused almost entirely on what officers discovered inside the Hamden residence. Today, investigators appear increasingly focused on the years before that discovery, where the family lived, who encountered them, whether warning signs were overlooked, and whether opportunities existed to intervene much earlier. Those questions may ultimately become just as important as the criminal charges themselves, because this investigation is no longer only about one house. It's about understanding how an entire family could allegedly remain beyond the reach of systems specifically designed to protect children. And with investigators continuing to analyze evidence, interview witnesses, review historical records, and prepare for what could become lengthy criminal proceedings, it appears that many of the most consequential developments are still ahead. As investigators continue to build their case, one thing has become increasingly clear. The rescue of the 16 children was not the conclusion of this story. It was the beginning of what could become one of the most closely watched child abuse and neglect prosecutions in Ohio in recent years. The headlines may have faded, but inside courtrooms and investigative offices, the work has only intensified. Every interview, every medical evaluation, every search warrant, and every piece of digital evidence now contributes to a timeline prosecutors must eventually present to a jury. And unlike the public, jurors won't decide this case based on emotion or media coverage. They'll be asked to weigh evidence that must prove every criminal allegation beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden is substantial. Prosecutors cannot simply argue that the conditions described by investigators were disturbing. They must demonstrate who was legally responsible for those conditions, how long they existed, and whether each defendant knowingly participated in or contributed to the alleged abuse and neglect. That is where the complexity of this case becomes apparent. With 4 defendants facing charges, prosecutors must establish each person's individual role rather than treating them as a single group. The evidence against one defendant may not necessarily be identical to the evidence against another. Jurors will likely be instructed to evaluate each person separately, considering the specific allegations and evidence presented against them. This distinction is important because criminal responsibility is personal. A conviction cannot be based on association alone. Investigators are also expected to rely heavily on forensic evidence rather than emotional testimony alone. Medical records, photographs taken during the execution of search warrants, laboratory results, and expert evaluations could become some of the strongest evidence presented in court. Specialists may be asked to explain whether the children's physical condition was consistent with prolonged neglect, inadequate nutrition, or limited access to health care. Mental health professionals could also testify about developmental delays, communication difficulties, or signs of long-term psychological trauma. These experts do not determine guilt, but they help jurors understand the significance of the evidence. At the same time, defense attorneys will almost certainly challenge many of those conclusions. They may question the qualifications of expert witnesses, dispute medical interpretations, or argue that some conditions resulted from factors unrelated to criminal conduct. Cross-examination will play a critical role, as both sides attempt to persuade jurors that their interpretation of the evidence is the more credible one. That adversarial process is exactly how the justice system is designed to function. One of the more difficult aspects of this case involves determining how much evidence exists from the years before authorities entered the Hamden property. If prosecutors intend to argue that the alleged neglect occurred over an extended period, they will need evidence reaching far beyond the day of the rescue. That could include historical records, testimony from former neighbors, landlords, educators, health care providers, or anyone else who had contact with the family over the years. The challenge is that memories fade, documents can be lost, witnesses relocate, and reconstructing years of family history is rarely straightforward. That is one reason investigators continue reviewing records from multiple jurisdictions connected to the family's previous residences. Every confirmed date helps strengthen the overall timeline. Every verified document reduces uncertainty. Every corroborated witness statement increases confidence in the case prosecutors ultimately present. Meanwhile, child welfare experts continue emphasizing that recovery for the 16 children will likely be measured in years rather than months. For children removed from situations involving alleged long-term neglect, healing often involves much more than physical care. Many require educational assessments to determine academic placement. Others may need speech therapy, occupational therapy, counseling, trauma-informed mental health services, or specialized medical treatment. Some children recover remarkably quickly once they begin receiving consistent care. Others face challenges that persist long after the criminal proceedings end. For that reason, many details regarding the children's current circumstances remain protected by law. Juvenile privacy laws exist to safeguard children from unnecessary public exposure, particularly in highly publicized cases. While public curiosity is understandable, courts generally prioritize protecting the identities, medical information, educational records, and long-term well-being of minors. That protection is likely to remain in place throughout the legal process. Outside the courtroom, the case has also prompted renewed discussion about the systems intended to protect vulnerable children. Questions continue to be raised about whether warning signs were missed, whether communication between agencies could have been stronger, and whether earlier intervention might have changed the outcome. These are difficult questions because child protection systems often depend on reports from teachers, healthcare workers, neighbors, relatives, and members of the public. When children have limited contact with those outside their immediate household, opportunities for intervention become significantly more limited. That broader conversation extends beyond Ohio. Across the United States, child welfare experts have pointed to similar cases where prolonged isolation complicated detection. While each case is unique, they often share common themes: limited outside contact, inconsistent schooling, infrequent medical care, and reduced interaction with community institutions that typically identify signs of abuse or neglect. Whether policymakers ultimately recommend changes to existing procedures remains to be seen, but the Siders investigation has already become part of a much larger national discussion. Another issue investigators continue examining is digital evidence. Modern investigations frequently involve the analysis of cell phones, computers, cloud storage accounts, internet activity, financial records, and electronic communications. Digital evidence can help establish timelines, verify locations, corroborate witness statements, and identify communications relevant to the investigation. Authorities have not publicly disclosed the full scope of any digital evidence recovered in this case, and much of that information may remain sealed until introduced in court. If additional evidence exists, it could significantly influence future hearings. Likewise, prosecutors must carefully manage the release of information. While public interest remains intense, investigators are often cautious about discussing evidence before trial. Premature disclosure can complicate jury selection, affect witness testimony, or create legal challenges regarding pretrial publicity. For that reason, many of the most important details may not become public until formal court proceedings begin. As those proceedings move forward, pretrial hearings are expected to address numerous legal issues before a jury is ever selected. Defense attorneys may file motions challenging search warrants, evidence collection procedures, or the admissibility of certain statements. Prosecutors, in turn, will argue that investigators acted lawfully and that the evidence should be presented at trial. These hearings rarely receive the same level of media attention as the initial arrests, but they often shape the outcome of major criminal cases. A judge's ruling on a single evidentiary issue can dramatically affect what jurors are ultimately allowed to hear. The prosecution must also consider whether additional charges could emerge if new evidence is uncovered. At this stage, authorities have not announced any new criminal counts beyond those already filed. However, investigations remain active, and prosecutors generally retain the ability to seek additional charges if future evidence supports them. That possibility is one reason investigators continue conducting interviews and reviewing historical records. The work is ongoing. The legal process, however, moves deliberately. Complex criminal cases involving multiple defendants, extensive evidence, and numerous witnesses often take many months, and sometimes years, to reach trial. Continuances, evidentiary hearings, expert evaluations, and scheduling issues all contribute to that timeline. While that pace can be frustrating for observers, it is intended to ensure that both the prosecution and the defense have adequate opportunity to prepare. Justice is not served by rushing a case of this magnitude. It is served by presenting reliable evidence that withstands legal scrutiny. For the communities following this story, patience may prove difficult. The initial discovery generated immediate shock because the images and allegations were so disturbing. Naturally, many people want quick answers and swift accountability. But criminal investigations do not operate on the same timeline as public attention. Investigators must verify every claim. Prosecutors must evaluate every piece of evidence. Defense attorneys must examine every allegation, and judges must ensure the process remains fair for everyone involved. Only then can a verdict carry lasting legitimacy. As this case continues, one of the most important principles to remember is the distinction between allegations and proof. The accusations outlined by prosecutors are undeniably serious. Yet under the American legal system, every defendant remains presumed innocent unless and until guilt is established in court. That presumption is not a technicality. It is a constitutional safeguard designed to protect the integrity of the justice system itself. Whatever conclusions ultimately emerge will be determined not by headlines, online discussions, or public opinion, but by evidence presented under oath in a courtroom. For now, many questions remain unanswered. Will investigators uncover additional evidence from the family's previous residences? Will new witnesses come forward? Will prosecutors expand the timeline they allege in court? Will any plea agreements be reached before trial? Or will every allegation be contested before a jury? Those questions remain open. What is certain is that this investigation is far from over. The rescue of 16 children was only the first chapter in a much larger legal process, one that will continue to unfold through court filings, evidentiary hearings, expert testimony, and, ultimately, the pursuit of justice through the judicial system. As verified information continues to emerge, we'll continue following every significant development and separating confirmed facts from speculation. If you appreciate factual, in-depth, true crime documentaries that prioritize verified reporting over sensationalism, make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future investigations and updates.